The air in the grand chamber of the High Council did not smell of diplomacy. It smelled of ozone, burnt circuitry, and the pheromones of terrified predators. This was the heart of the Gracian citadel, a massive structure carved directly into the core of a rogue moon that orbited a dying brown dwarf, a location chosen not for its beauty, but for its harsh, unforgiving nature, a symbol of the strength that defined the Deathworld Alliance. Here, the floor was not polished marble, but a grate of reinforced heavy metals situated over a magma-driven heating system that kept the reptilian Gracian warm and the insectoid crawl agile. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the council table, a slab of obsidian so dark it seemed to absorb the dim, red emergency lighting that bathed the room. The hologram in the center of the table flickered, struggling against the ambient radiation of the brown dwarf outside, projecting a grainy, terrifying image of the entity that had brought the galaxy's mightiest warriors to their knees. They called it the Pale Leviathan, a ship of such colossal scale and impossible geometry that it defied the known laws of physics, a silent white obelisk that sat motionless in the void of the Antares sector, waiting. It did not communicate. It did not maneuver. It simply existed, and when approached, it erased existence. High Admiral Vrax of the Crawl chattered his mandibles, a sound like grinding stones that usually commanded absolute silence and respect. But today, it merely added to the cacophony of panicked whispers. Vrax was a behemoth of a creature, his chitinous armor scarred from 100 campaigns on worlds with gravity that would crush a lesser species to paste. He stood, his 4 primary arms resting heavily on the obsidian table, his compound eyes fracturing the red light into 1,000 angry reflections. He looked at the hologram, then at the scattered reports of the 7th Fleet, or what remained of it. There were no debris fields, no distress beacons, no survivors. The 7th Fleet, the pride of the Alliance, comprised of dreadnoughts forged in the fires of volcanic worlds and crewed by species who breathed methane and drank acid, had simply ceased to be. The Pale Leviathan had emitted a single pulse, a ripple in the fabric of spacetime that the sensors registered as a gravitational shear, and the fleet had been unmade. Vrax felt a cold sensation in his gut, an emotion he had been bred to suppress, helplessness. The Deathworld Alliance was founded on a simple, brutal truth, that the universe was a crucible, and only those forged in the harshest environments had the right to rule it. They were the survivors, the apex predators of 1,000 hellscapes. And yet, against this silent white tomb in the stars, they were nothing more than dust. Sitting across from Vrax was Counselor Alaris of the Authari, a species of avian grace and predatory intellect, her feathers shimmering with the iridescent sheen of oil on water. She was the voice of reason in a room of warriors, though her reason was often as sharp and cold as a scalpel. She manipulated the controls of the hologram with a slender, taloned hand, zooming in on the smooth, featureless hull of the enemy ship. She spoke, her voice a melodic trill that carried an undercurrent of steel, reminding the council that brute force had failed 6 times. She argued that the definition of strength needed to be reevaluated, a suggestion that caused the heavy, rock-skinned Goran representative to slam a fist onto the table, cracking the obsidian. The Goran roared that they needed more ships, bigger guns, heavier shielding. They proposed stripping the atmosphere of a gas giant to fuel a weapon of planetary destruction. Alaris countered that they had already fired weapons capable of cracking moons at the Leviathan, and the energy had simply been absorbed, seemingly feeding the entity. The room descended into a chaotic argument, a clash of martial philosophies that had served them well for millennia but were now useless. The air grew hot, the tension palpable, a thick sludge of anger and denial. They were the masters of the galaxy, the conquerors of the dark, and they were being humiliated by a geometric shape that refused to acknowledge them as a threat. It was into this atmosphere of impending doom that the topic of the Terran application was raised, almost as an afterthought, a desperate joke thrown into the fire of their anxiety. The humans, the species from the planet Earth. The room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of incredulity. Vrax let out a hissing laugh, a sound of derision that rippled through his thorax. Earth was a Class 1 habitable zone world. It had a stable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, abundant liquid water, a magnetosphere that protected it from radiation, and gravity that was laughably standard. It was a paradise, a garden. In the eyes of the Deathworld Alliance, humans were soft. They had not evolved in the crushing PTHS of a supergravity well or the freezing winds of a rogue planet. They had no natural armor, no claws, no venom. They were soft-skinned, slow, and fragile. The idea that these garden worlders could offer anything to the war effort against the Pale Leviathan was insulting. The humans had applied for membership in the Alliance 3 cycles ago, and the application had been kept in pending status, a bureaucratic limbo meant to politely tell them they weren't wanted. But now, with the fleets burning and the Leviathan slowly drifting closer to the core systems, the Authari counselor Alaris suggested that they had nothing left to lose. She pointed out that while humans lacked biological hardiness, their technology was odd. Not overwhelming, not massive, but distinct. The debate that followed was long and circular, a deep dive into the prejudices of the Alliance. The Goran argued that sending humans to the Leviathan would be like throwing insects at a star. The Krawl argued that it would be a waste of fuel to escort them there. But Alaris persisted. She noted that the human diplomatic envoy had remained in orbit around the Citadel for weeks, waiting patiently, never complaining, never showing fear despite the aggressive posturing of the Alliance traffic controllers. She highlighted a peculiar report from a border skirmish years ago where a human vessel, a science ship, had outmaneuvered a pirate raiding party not by firing back, but by venting its own atmosphere to create a thrust vector that the pirates, targeting computers, couldn't predict. It was insanity, she admitted, but it was calculated insanity. And perhaps, against an enemy that defied logic, insanity was what was required. Reluctantly, with heavy sighs and gestures of dismissal, the High Council authorized the summoning of the Terran delegation. They expected a warrior in power armor, or perhaps a genetically modified soldier. They expected bluster and pleading. They prepared to sneer. When the heavy blast doors of the grand chamber groaned open, revealing the corridor beyond, the silence in the room was absolute. The figure that entered did not march. He walked. He was of average height, wearing a uniform of dark blue fabric that seemed impossibly thin compared to the armored carapaces of the counselors. He had no visible weapons. His face was exposed, pale and fleshy, with two forward-facing eyes that scanned the room with a terrifying calmness. This was Admiral James Halloway of the Terran Union. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, lines of stress etched around his mouth, but his posture was upright, relaxed. He was followed by two aides, equally unarmed, carrying data slates. They looked like they were walking into a library, not a war council of the galaxy's deadliest predators. Halloway stopped at the foot of the obsidian table, waiting. He did not bow. He did not bare his teeth in a challenge. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Vrax with an expression of polite inquiry. The contrast was jarring. Surrounded by creatures of nightmare, by beings who could tear steel with their bare claws, the human looked small. And yet he did not smell of fear. The pheromone sensors in the room remained flat. He smelled of synthetic soap and coffee. Vrax broke the silence, his voice booming through the translator speakers, accusing the humans of wasting the Council's time. He detailed the threat of the pale Leviathan, describing the horror of the gravitational shears, the erasure of the fleets. He leaned forward, his mandibles clicking aggressively, demanding to know what a species that evolved in a petting zoo could possibly do against a god of death. Halloway listened until the crawl was finished. He didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, measured, and amplified perfectly by the room's acoustics. He didn't apologize for his biology. He didn't boast about hidden fleets. He merely asked to see the sensor logs, not the tactical summaries, but the raw data, the wave forms, the radiometric decay rates, the background static. The Council was baffled. They had expected a plea for protection or a grandiose offer of suicide troops. Instead, the human wanted to look at the math. With a wave of a claw, Alaris granted the request, transferring the data to the holographic display. Halloway stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the streams of numbers cascade through the air. He watched the footage of the 7th Fleet's destruction. He watched the way the ships crumpled, imploding into pinpoints of light. For a long time, the human said nothing. The Council grew restless. The Goran representative grunted, preparing to dismiss them. Then Halloway pointed a finger at the hologram, right at the center of the pale Leviathan's hull, just before the moment of firing. He asked a question that no one had considered. Why does the background radiation drop to absolute 0 3 seconds before the attack? The counselors looked at each other. They had been looking at the energy spikes, the weapon signatures. They hadn't noticed the silence. Halloway explained, his tone like a professor lecturing a class of unruly students, that energy cannot be created or destroyed. If the Leviathan was generating a gravity well strong enough to crush a dreadnought, it had to be drawing that energy from somewhere. But it wasn't drawing it from a reactor. The drop in background radiation suggested it was drawing energy from the vacuum itself, from the fabric of space. It wasn't a weapon, it was a siphon. And if it was a siphon, it had an intake. And if it had an intake, it could be choked. The room was stunned. The logic was sound, terrifyingly simple, yet it had eluded them because they were thinking in terms of armor and ballistics, of shielding and thrust. They viewed the universe as a thing to be fought, while the human viewed it as a system to be understood. Vrax was skeptical. He demanded to know how the humans proposed to choke a ship the size of a city that could manipulate gravity. Holloway's expression shifted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, not of arrogance, but of grim determination. He said the Terran Union had brought a ship, just one. The UNS Hephaestus. It was not a dreadnought. It was an engineering vessel, a deep space construct usually used for building Dyson swarms or stabilizing colony stars. He proposed a joint operation. The Alliance would provide the distraction, the noise, the targets. They would draw the Leviathan's gaze. And while the entity was busy crushing the invincible armadas of the Deathworlders, the human ship would slip into the intake vector and deploy a solution. The Council was insulted by the term distraction, but they were desperate. They agreed, but Vrax insisted on accompanying the human vessel. He wanted to see them fail. He wanted to witness the moment the Garden Worlders realized that the universe did not care for their equations. The mobilization was a spectacle of galactic scale. The remnants of the Alliance fleets gathered at the edge of the Antares sector. It was a sea of metal, jagged cruisers of the Crawl, spherical war moons of the Goran, needle fighters of the Authari. They burned with the light of 1,000 engines, a display of martial pride that would have terrified any other civilization. In the center of this armada sat the UNS Hephaestus. It was ugly. It was a massive, blocky framework of girders, fuel tanks, and sensor arrays, lacking the sleek armor or intimidation factor of the alien warships. It looked like a floating oil refinery. Vrax, standing on the bridge of the Hephaestus alongside Admiral Holloway, felt a deep sense of embarrassment. He was surrounded by humans who sat at their consoles with focused intensity. There was no shouting, no ritual chanting, no beating of chests. Just the quiet hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tapping of fingers on keys. Holloway sat in his command chair, sipping a hot liquid from a ceramic cup, watching the main screen. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a man about to charge into the maw of a cosmic horror. The fleet jumped. The transition to the Antares sector was instantaneous, a tearing of the veil that deposited them light seconds away from the pale Leviathan. The entity was there waiting. It was even more terrifying in person. It hung against the backdrop of stars like a hole in reality, its white surface reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. The moment the Alliance fleet arrived, the Leviathan reacted. It didn't turn, it simply shifted its presence. The gravitational shear began. The forward elements of the Goran fleet, massive ships with hull plating meters thick, began to scream. Metal groaned across the vacuum frequencies. Ships were compressed, folded in on themselves like tin cans. The comms channels erupted in screams and roars of defiance. Vrax gripped the railing of the human bridge, his instincts screaming at him to fire, to fight, to do something. But the Hephaestus did not fire. It did not raise shields. It accelerated. "Steady," Holloway said, his voice cutting through the panic on the bridge. "Wait for the harmonic resonance." The human ship dove toward the Leviathan, weaving through the debris of the Alliance fleet. To Vrax, it was suicide. They were flying naked into a storm, but as they approached the zone where the gravity shears were strongest, the crew of the Hephaestus did something inexplicable. They activated the resonance emitters. Massive dishes along the hull of the engineering ship lit up, not with lasers, but with pulses of pure sound, or rather, the electromagnetic equivalent of sound. They broadcasted a frequency that matched the background radiation the Leviathan was absorbing. They were feeding it. Vrax roared, asking why they were strengthening the enemy. Holloway didn't look back. "We aren't strengthening it," he said. "We're overfeeding it. We're creating a feedback loop." The effect was subtle at first, then catastrophic. The pale Leviathan, which had been methodically crushing the Alliance fleet, suddenly shuddered. The gravitational waves became erratic, losing their focus. Ships that should have been destroyed were merely rattled. The invisible grip that held the sector hostage began to slip. The Hephaestus pushed closer, right into the mouth of the beast, the point where the sensors indicated the maximum energy intake. The hull of the human ship groaned, rivets popping, warning lights flashing red across every console. But the humans held their course. They were calm. They adjusted power output, rerouted conduits, and balanced the load with a terrifying proficiency. They were treating the battle not as a fight, but as a high-stakes engineering problem. They were deconstructing the enemy. "Deployment range achieved," a navigation officer announced. "Deploy the anchor," Holloway ordered. From the belly of the Hephaestus, a massive cylinder was ejected. It wasn't a bomb. It was a gravity anchor, a device used to stabilize wormholes. It shot into the center of the Leviathan's intake field and activated. The result was instantaneous. The Leviathan's internal siphon tried to crush the anchor, but the anchor was designed to hold space fixed. The conflict between the immovable object and the irresistible force created a shockwave, not of explosion, but of static. The Leviathan system seized. The white glow of its hull dimmed. The gravity field collapsed completely. The Alliance fleet, battered and confused, found themselves floating in calm space. The monster was dead, or at least it was paralyzed. Silence returned to the bridge of the Hephaestus. Vrax stared at the screen, his mandibles hanging open. They had done it. Without firing a single shot, without sacrificing 1,000,000 lives, the humans had neutralized the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen. They had used physics, not fury. Holloway set his cup down. "We have a stable interface," he said. "Prepare the boarding party. I want to know who built this thing." Vrax insisted on joining the boarding party. He needed to understand. He needed to see the inside of the monster. The shuttle ride over was tense. The human Marines were armored, yes, but their armor was practical, covered in pockets and sensors, not spikes and trophies. They carried weapons, but they held them low. When they breached the hull of the pale Leviathan, they didn't find a warship. They found a cathedral. The interior was vast, echoing, and empty of crew. The architecture was ancient, smooth curves and white light, pulsating with a low, rhythmic thrumming. It felt like walking into the ribcage of a living god. They made their way to the core, navigating through corridors that seemed to shift and change direction. The humans used mapping drones to find the path, their curiosity evident in every scan they took. Vrax felt a creeping dread. This place was too old, too advanced. It made the Deathworld Alliance look like children playing with sticks. When they finally reached the central control chamber, they found the truth, and it broke Vrax's world. The core was not a weapon control system. It was a communications array and a prison cell. In the center of the room, suspended in a field of amber light, was a being. It was small, frail, with large eyes that held the weight of eons. It was dead, or in deep stasis, its life support failing. The consoles around it were flashing with data that the human linguists began to decode immediately. As the translation matrix ran, the story of the pale Leviathan unspooled on the screens. It was not an invader. It was a guardian. The species that built it, the Ethelgard, had been the precursors, the first masters of the galaxy. They had encountered something in the dark space between galaxies, a cosmic entropy, a hunger that consumed stars. They had built these ships, these white monoliths, to act as gravity dams, to shore up the weak points in reality where the hunger tried to break through. The Leviathan had been stationed in the Antares sector not to destroy the Alliance, but to stop them from passing through. The sector was a thin spot. If the Alliance had continued their expansion, their warp drives would have torn the fabric of space and let the horror in. The Leviathan had been attacking them to push them back, to save them from their own ignorance. But the Leviathan was malfunctioning. Its crew had died millennia ago. Its automated systems were degrading, losing the nuance of warning, and defaulting to sterilization. The gravity shears were desperate attempts to patch the widening cracks in reality. The Alliance had been warring against the dam that was holding back the flood. Vrax read the translation, feeling a nausea that had nothing to do with biology. They had been wrong. Everything they believed, that strength was conquest, that violence was the only language, was wrong. We. Ray children throwing rocks at a barricade that protected them from the wolves. He looked at Holloway. The human was reading the data, his face pale. "It's failing," Holloway whispered. "The anchor we deployed. It stopped the attacks, but it also shut down the repair protocols. The tier is opening." The room rumbled. The white walls turned a sickly gray. The reality outside the ship began to fray. Without the Leviathan's gravity weaving, the void was leaking in. A coldness that defied sensors swept through the chamber. "We have to leave," Vrax hissed. "We must retreat and quarantine the sector." Holloway shook his head. "No, if we leave, the tier expands. It will consume the Antares sector, then the next, then the core worlds. The dam must be fixed." "We cannot fix this," Vrax roared. "This is tech beyond gods." "It's engineering," Holloway snapped, his voice suddenly hard, commanding. "It's just advanced engineering, and we are here." The humans moved. They didn't retreat. They didn't run. They rushed toward the consoles. They began to interface their clumsy, primitive tech with the crystalline systems of the ancients. Holloway barked orders referencing theories and physics that Vrax couldn't comprehend. They were going to restart the engine, but not as an automated system. They were going to manual control. They were going to become the new crew. "Admiral," a young human technician called out, "the power coupling is fried. We can't jumpstart the gravity weave without a massive energy surge. The Hephaestus doesn't have the output." Holloway looked at Vrax. For the first time, the human looked tired. "Hi, Admiral," he said. "Your fleet, the Goran War Moons, they have fusion cores, dirty and raw but powerful. Can you link them?" Vrax hesitated. To link their ships to this alien tomb was madness. It would leave them defenseless. It would drain them dry. "Why?" he asked. "Why sacrifice for a galaxy that mocks you? You are soft. You are weak." Holloway smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "That's why we survived, Vrax. We aren't strong because we can endure the cold. We're strong because we learned to build fires. We don't break the world, we fix it. Now give me the power or we all die." Vrax looked at the human, this soft, fleshy creature standing in the heart of a dying god, ready to shoulder the weight of the universe. And in that moment the Crawl understood. The Deathworlders survived their environments. Humans mastered them. The Alliance was the shield, perhaps, but the humans, they were the hands. Vrax activated his comms. He ordered the fleet to lower shields and channel all reactor output to the Hephaestus tether. He ordered them to trust the humans. The energy surged. A river of fire flowed from the jagged, scarred warships of the Alliance into the blocky, ugly human engineering ship, and from there into the heart of the pale Leviathan. The white walls screamed with light. The gravity engine roared back to life, not with the erratic spasms of a dying machine, but with the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat. The humans worked the controls, their fingers bleeding, their minds racing to keep up with the alien data flow. They wove the gravity back together. They sealed the tier. Outside, the darkness receded. The stars returned. The Leviathan stabilized, its hull glowing with a gentle, golden light. Holloway slumped against the console, wiping sweat from his brow. The immediate crisis was over. But as the system stabilized, the Leviathan's deep-range sensors came online, sensors that could see further than anything the Alliance possessed. They projected a map of the galaxy and beyond. And that was the final twist. The map showed the great enemy, the entropy the Leviathan was built to hold back. It wasn't just in the Antares sector. The map showed thousands of red fractures appearing all along the galactic rim. The Leviathan was just one dam of many, and the others were failing. The ancient signal that flashed across the screen was not a victory fanfare. It was a distress call. It was a request for relief crews. The Alliance had spent centuries fighting each other, puffing out their chests, proud of their Deathworld status. But looking at that map, seeing the encroaching dark that threatened to swallow all light, Vrax realized the war had not even begun. The real war, the war for existence, was just starting. He looked at Holloway, who was staring at the same map, his expression grim but resolving into that same terrifying calmness. The human didn't look despairing. He looked like he was already planning the logistics. "Looks like we have a lot of work to do," Holloway said quietly. Vrax clicked his mandibles, a sound that was no longer one of aggression but of respect. He bowed, a low, scraping bow that no Crawl had ever offered to a non-Deathworlder. "Then lead us, Admiral," Vrax said. "The Alliance is yours to command. The Deathworlds have the strength, but Earth has the key." The CH. Amber was silent, save for the hum of the machine. The galaxy had changed. The hierarchy of power had been overturned not by conquest, but by competence. The soft, green world of Earth had joined the fight, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the monsters of the dark had reason to fear, not the claws of the Crawl or the fleets of the Goran, but the relentless, stubborn, terrifying hope of humanity. The pale Leviathan pulsed once, a golden heartbeat against the eternal night, and the fleets turned together, facing the rim, facing the coming storm, united by the only thing that mattered in the end: the will to fix what was broken. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic, yet strangely unifying. When the fleet returned to the Citadel, they did not return as a beaten remnant, but as heralds of a new reality. The footage from the core of the Leviathan was broadcast to every council member, every world, every citizen of the Alliance. The image of the human admiral standing amidst the alien geometry, channeling the raw power of the Crawl warships to stitch the universe back together, shattered the cultural foundations of the Deathworlders. There was denial, of course. The Goran riots were particularly violent, their warrior caste unable to accept that their strength had been irrelevant. But the truth was in the sky. The Antares sector, once a graveyard of ships, was now stable. The gravity storms had ceased. Commercial lanes were reopening. The evidence was irrefutable. The integration of humanity into the Alliance was no longer an application, it was a necessity, but it was not a smooth process. The humans did not demand leadership, which terrified the Council more than if they had. If the humans had demanded a seat at the head of the table, the Authari would have understood. That was politics. But the humans demanded standardization. They demanded resource sharing. They demanded the creation of a generic engineering corps. They were not interested in ruling. They were interested in surviving the coming storm. This baffled the Authari Councillor Alaris. She sat with Ambassador Halloway, now promoted to the primary liaison, in a private chamber overlooking the Citadel's shipyards. "You do not seek the crown of stars?" Alaris asked, her head tilting bird-like. "You saved the fleet. You possess the codes to the Leviathan. You could demand the surrender of the Goran High Command, and they would likely give it to you out of shame." Halloway chuckled, looking out the window where human construction drones were already swarming over the damaged Crawl dreadnoughts, welding repairs with a speed and precision that shamed the Alliance shipwrights. "We don't want the crown, Alaris. Heavy lies the head and all that. We want the wrench. We want to keep the lights on. That map we saw, the red fractures, that's an existential threat. If we waste time arguing over who sits in the big chair, the dark eats us all. Humans. We have a history of ignoring the big problems until the water is at our door. We learned the hard way. We aren't making that mistake on a galactic scale." This philosophy, this pragmatic stewardship, began to seep into the Alliance culture. It was slow, agonizing work. The Crawl had to learn that backing down from a suicidal charge wasn't cowardice, but tactical conservation. The Xyle, the energy beings who worshipped pure logic, found themselves delighted by human creativity, the ability to make intuitive leaps that bypassed cycles of calculation. The humans introduced the concept of asymmetric warfare to the Council, not fighting force with force, but fighting force with leverage. They began to retro-engineer the Leviathan technology. It wasn't magic. It was just manipulation of the Planck length, scaling up quantum effects to macro levels. Human scientists worked side by side with Goran smiths, teaching them to fold metal in 4D space. The twist, the true horror revealed by the Leviathan's archives, gnawed at the back of everyone's mind. The great enemy. The humans called it the entropy. The Alliance called it the silence. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a biological plague. It was the heat death of the universe, weaponized. A civilization from a higher energy state was trying to harvest the kinetic potential of this galaxy to sustain their own dying reality. They were vampire gods, drilling holes in the universe to drink the warmth. The Leviathans were the plugs, and the plugs were rotting. 6 months after the Antares incident, the second crisis struck. This time it wasn't a silent ship, it was a breach. In the Vega system, a thriving industrial hub of the Alliance, the star began to dim. Not fade, but dim, as if something was sucking the light out of it. Gravity fluctuations tore the planets from their orbits. The panic was absolute. The Alliance fleet mobilized, but they were frozen by fear. They knew their guns were useless. They looked to the humans. Admiral Halloway was LD now, the stress of the last months aging him rapidly, but he stood on the bridge of the newly retrofitted Pale Leviathan, now the flagship of the joint fleet. The ship was no longer a tomb. It was alive with the chatter of a dozen species. Crawl security officers stood guard at the bulkheads. Authari navigators plotted the slipstreams. Human engineers manned the core. "Take us in," Halloway ordered. The Leviathan jumped. They arrived at Vega to find a nightmare. A tear in space, jagged and weeping purple light, was attached to the star like a leech. It was vast, thousands of kilometers wide. Tentacles of shadow were lashing out, grabbing asteroids, ships, anything, and dragging them into the tear. "Analysis," Halloway barked. "It's an active siphon," a Xyle science officer reported, their voice buzzing with static. "They are harvesting the stellar mass directly. The star will collapse in 3 standard hours." "Can we seal it?" "The local gravity anchors are shattered. We need to generate a counterpulse, but the energy requirement—" "We know the drill," Halloway said. "Fleet-wide comms." He stood before the transmitter. He didn't give a speech about glory. He didn't promise victory. "This is Admiral Halloway. We have a breach. The procedure is the same as Antares, but the scale is higher. We need to form a Dyson link. All ships, grid pattern Alpha 9. You are going to run your reactors hot. If you redline, you vent and keep pushing. We are the only thing standing between Vega and the dark. Execute." The maneuver was beautiful. Thousands of Alliance ships, species that had hated each other for eons, moved in perfect synchronization, guided by human tactical algorithms. They surrounded the dying star, forming a sphere of steel. They opened their reactor cowlings. Beams of raw energy lanced out, connecting ship to ship, forming a web of light that funneled into the pale Leviathan. The ancient ship acted as the lens. It took the fire of the Alliance and focused it into a single beam of white gravity. The beam struck the purple tier. The reaction was blinding. Space screamed. The shadow tentacles thrashed, whipping through the fleet. Ships exploded. A Goran cruiser took a direct hit to shield another vessel, breaking apart in silence. But the line held. The white beam pushed the purple darkness back, inch by inch, cauterizing the wound in the sky. On the bridge, the strain was physical. Sparks rained from the ceiling. The floor plates buckled. Vrax, standing beside Holloway, held the human admiral steady as the ship shook violently. "It fights back," Vrax roared. "Push harder," Holloway yelled. And then something happened that no one expected. The tier didn't just close, it spoke. A voice not of sound but of thought slammed into the minds of every being in the system. It was cold, arrogant, and ancient. "You are vermin in the walls, stop struggling." It was the enemy, the outsiders. For the first time, they had acknowledged the galaxy they were feeding on. The psychological shock was immense. To be called vermin by a god, it broke the resolve of the Authari navigators. They began to weep. The formation wavered. Holloway grabbed the comms. He didn't scream, he laughed. It was a dry, raspy sound, but it carried over the open channel. "Vermin," Holloway said, his voice dripping with human defiance. "You think we're vermin? Let me tell you something about vermin. We survive, we adapt, and we multiply. You're not gods, you're just a pest control problem, and we are the exterminators." He slammed his hand onto the manual override. "Overcharge the core, give them everything." The humans on the bridge roared. The crawl roared. The defiance was infectious. The Alliance poured their hate, their fear, their will to live into the beam. The pale Leviathan shone with the brightness of a supernova. The beam turned from white to a blinding violet. It punched through the resistance of the tier. With a sound like a cracking whip that spanned a solar system, the tier shattered. The purple light vanished. The leech was severed. The Star of Vega, wounded but stable, flared back to life. The fleet drifted in the silence. They were battered. They had lost hundreds of ships, but they were alive, and they had heard the enemy bleed. In the aftermath, the Council was silent. The message from the outsiders changed everything. It was no longer a natural disaster. It was a war of invasion. And the humans had insulted the gods to their face and lived. Vrax found Holloway in the medical bay. The Admiral had collapsed from exhaustion. He lay in a biobed, looking frail, his skin gray. Vrax looked at his own clawed hands, then at the human. "You spoke to them," Vrax said softly. "You mocked them." Holloway opened his eyes. They were dim, but the spark was there. "Psychological warfare, Vrax. If they think we're afraid, they win. If they think we're crazy, they hesitate. Hesitation buys time." "You are crazy," Vrax said. A rumble of affection in his chest. "All humans are crazy." "It's a requirement for the job," Holloway whispered. The war dragged on for years. The Alliance transformed. It became the Terran Alliance Defense Pact. The Deathworlds became the Forges. Earth became the Academy. Humans didn't teach the aliens how to be strong. They taught them how to be flexible. They built new ships, hybrids of Alliance brute force and Terran engineering. They reactivated more of the ancient monoliths. They established a perimeter. But the final realization, the true twist of the knife, came at the end of Holloway's life. The scientists had finally decoded the last layer of the Ethelgard archives. It wasn't just about the tears. The Ethelgard hadn't died out. They hadn't fled. They had devolved. The genetic analysis of the Alliance species revealed a shocking truth. The Crawl, the Goran, the Authari. They were the descendants of the Ethelgard. The precursors had genetically modified themselves to survive the harsh worlds they retreated to, sacrificing their intellect and technology for biological hardiness to endure the long night. They had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten they were the Guardians. And the humans? The humans were the control group. The one species left untouched on a paradise world, kept in a reserve to preserve the original template of creativity and adaptability, to be activated when the Guardians forgot their duty. Earth wasn't a new player. Earth was the backup drive. When this truth was revealed, it didn't cause chaos. It caused a profound spiritual silence. Vrax, now High Commander of the entire Defense Pact, stood before the grave of James Holloway on Earth. The wind blew through the grass, soft, green grass, so unlike the razor moss of his home. He understood now, the disdain they had felt for the soft world. It was jealousy. It was the subconscious memory of what they had lost. They had traded paradise for armor. They had traded peace for claws. Vrax placed a crawl on her blade on the stone. "We forgot the song," Vrax said to the wind, "but you kept the music." He looked up at the sky. The stars were still there. The cracks were sealed for now. The enemy was out there, hungry and waiting. But the Alliance was no longer a collection of scared monsters hiding in the dark. They were the children of the Guardians, awakened by their brothers. The Deathworld Alliance had faced the most dangerous ship in the galaxy and failed. But then Earth joined the fight, and they realized the ship was theirs, and the pilot had finally come home. The fleet waited in orbit, a mixture of jagged iron and sleek steel shimmering in the sunlight. Vrax tapped his comms. "All ships," he growled, his voice filled with a new kind of pride. "Prepare for departure. The perimeter needs reinforcing, and we have a universe to fix." The roar of the engines was not a sound of war. It was the sound of industry. It was the sound of a galaxy healing. It was the sound of humanity and its brothers getting to work. The Deathworld moniker was dropped. They were simply the Alliance, and they were unbreakable. The final phase of the conflict, known as the War of the Fractures, spanned a generation. It was not a war of territory, but of pressure. The outsiders, realizing their prey had evolved, escalated their attacks. They stopped trying to tear the sky and started trying to poison the mind. They sent signals of despair, psychic waves that caused entire planetary populations to lose the will to live. This was a weapon against which the Krall's armor and the Goran's strength were useless. A Goran warrior could fight a beast, but he could not fight the overwhelming urge to simply lie down and die. This was where humanity's true strength, the dangerous ship of the mind, revealed itself. It wasn't logic this time. It was art. It was culture. It was defiance through spirit. When the despair waves hit the colony of Athara Prime, the avian population stopped flying. They sat on their perches, starving, staring into nothing. The Alliance military was helpless. Quarantine failed. Then the humans deployed the Resonance Corps. Not soldiers, but musicians, poets, orators. They hijacked the planetary communication arrays. They didn't broadcast orders. They broadcasted symphonies. They broadcasted rock and roll. They broadcasted stories of impossible odds and triumphant endings. The human mind, it turned out, had evolved in a unique evolutionary pressure cooker. Humans had evolved with the knowledge of their own mortality, yet they built cathedrals. They knew they would die, yet they planted trees. They were naturally immune to the despair waves because they had been living with existential dread for their entire history. They had inoculated themselves with hope. The music broke the trance. The Athari took to the skies again, confused but alive. The outsiders were baffled. They understood energy, they did not understand jazz. They understood gravity, they did not understand spite. The culmination of the war took place at the Galactic core, near the supermassive black hole. The outsiders attempted one final, desperate strike. They tried to invert the black hole, to turn the galaxy's anchor into a bomb that would shatter reality completely, allowing them to feast on the scraps. The Alliance fleet gathered. It was the largest assembly of matter in the history of the universe. Millions of ships. But the key was the UNS Hephaestus II, a ship the size of a moon built around the core of the original Pale Leviathan. The battle was metaphysical. The outsiders manifested as shadows larger than suns. The Alliance ships were gnats against them. But the Hephaestus II carried a weapon designed by the combined genius of the awakened Ethelgard descendants and the Terran engineers. They called it the reality anchor. It wasn't a gun. It was a statement. A machine that projected a quantum field of absolute, unshakable normality. It asserted with the energy of a billion stars that it is that gravity pulls down, that time moves forward, and that the universe belongs to the living. They fired it into the black hole. The shadows screamed, not in pain but in denial. The field forced them to obey the laws of physics, and under the laws of physics, beings of pure entropy cannot exist in a stable universe. They didn't explode. They simply evaporated. They were legislated out of existence by the collective will of the Alliance. The black hole stabilized, the shadows vanished, the galaxy was safe. In the quiet that followed, the Alliance looked at what they had achieved. They had killed gods with physics and music. Decades later, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The harsh, brutalist architecture of the Deathworlders had softened. Greenery was introduced to the lava worlds of the Goran, protected by terraforming domes. The crawl developed a taste for literature. The humans, the humans remained humans, restless, chaotic, always looking for the next problem. On the anniversary of the victory, a new monument was unveiled on the citadel. It wasn't a statue of a warrior. It was a simple, rough-hewn stone archway. On one side, the jagged glyphs of the crawl. On the other, the flowing script of the Authari. And in the center, a plaque in English. It read, "To the monsters we were. To the guardians we became. And to the humans who introduced us to ourselves. The universe is dark and full of terrors. So we brought a flashlight." The most dangerous ship in the title of the history books was no longer the pale Leviathan. It was the UNS Diplomat, a small, unarmed shuttle that had carried James Halloway to the Council of Ash all those years ago. For it was that ship that carried the most dangerous weapon of all, an idea. The idea that you don't have to be the strongest to win. You just have to be the one who refuses to give up. And as the galaxy turned, spinning slowly in the vast, reclaimed night, the Alliance stood ready. Not as masters, but as gardeners. The Deathworlds were gone. Life had bloomed. And in the center of it all, Earth spun, a blue marble of infinite improbability, the beating heart of a galaxy that had learned, finally, how to live.